Good evening, everybody. How we doing today? My name is Dan, aka the Jazz Shepherd. Hope you're all doing well. Coming at you a bit of a weird time today, Friday evening, here in the Midwest. East Coast is probably already becoming after dinner. In Europe, it's probably now late evening, if not middle of the night. And if we're in the Far East, the sun's probably just starting to crack the horizon on Saturday. Uh, that last episode on Discogs had a lot of viewership. I was happy to see that. I guess a lot of people found some value in that. It's a great site. You're dealing with used records, so it's not always going to be perfect all the time. But like I said, I've bought thousands of records there, and I have a pretty decent track record in association with what Discogs is about. And I certainly wouldn't hesitate to tell anyone to use Discogs as a resource. And it is how most sellers gauge what records are going for. And so it's a tool to use just to know what you're buying, what pressing you're buying. It's pretty invaluable once you know how to use it. Most record store clerks will be looking up something on Discogs to see, okay, this is a third edition, blah, blah, blah. And so it's kind of become a standard market stabilizer in a lot of ways, even though there's always a few outliers that pay 3 times what they should for something. It does give you a much more grounded look at what things are selling for and going for. I do want to say I'm down 17 pounds since January. Been going to the gym, playing basketball, trying to get in shape. It's not easy when you're 50 years old, 49, but it's starting to really make a difference, and I feel much better. 17 pounds is a lot of fat, and I still got a long ways to go. I'm not even halfway, I don't think, but by my birthday I want to be down 40. So that's August. That's when I turned 50 in the beginning of August. So we're shooting for that. So that's good news, though. And I do feel quite a lot better on my feet and my knees and everything else. Today I want to talk to you about George Benson. And Benson's one of the truly great performers in jazz. And he comes in at the end of the era I really talk about a lot. So I don't talk about the 70s and 80s very often. I do like a lot of 70s jazz, but I like the stuff that's much more R&B crossover influence. And from my perspective DJing in the black community for a long time, the R&B side of things is, from that perception, where jazz went. Jazz didn't die. It just grafted itself into a new thing that was danceable once again. And it stayed a commodity that was relevant. And I think that idea, that notion that the avant-garde and the free jazz, that's where jazz went. That's not really what the sales tell you. It's not what was selling in any kind of sense. And even though a lot of what becomes R&B has jazz roots in it, like Kool and the Gang, Ohio Players, Earth, Wind and Fire, those bands were rooted in, a lot of them played in jazz bands in this late 60s that were kind of crossing that fusion, that line between rhythm and blues and jazz. And jazz has always kind of been watching the rhythm and blues, rock and roll extract components from it. When rock and roll first starts showing up, it's really just R&B and the jump blues and all those things that were happening in the 50s and the 40s with big Arthur Crudup and of course, guys like Chuck Berry, even Little Richard, Ray Charles. They were taking things that were rooted in jazz and blues, and rhythm and blues comes out of that whole soup. And jazz doesn't really die. It just kind of changes its shape, as it always has done. And so in a lot of ways, I think there's a lot of misguidance in terms of what's happening in jazz in the 70s. And there's a lot of people that have a lot of different opinions on what's jazz in the 70s and what's not. Even the term fusion gets thrown around a lot. But fusion, if you define the word itself, is a mixing of 2 things, maybe 3 things. And jazz fuses with rhythm and blues. Jazz also fuses with rock and roll. And so fusion is really anything that has that fusion of sound. I think some of the hardcore fusion people who like Bitches Brew and Jack Johnson, some of that tougher Miles Davis stuff, and the Herbie Hancock Mwandishi band. Those records are challenging listens. They're for music heads. They have weird time signatures, weird key changes, weird scales that the musicians are soloing on. A lot of it's lost on the common listener. I think a lot of people feel kind of obligated to say, "Oh, that's brilliant," as I've said about Bitches Brew many times, and it's okay to say, "No, that's not really for me." But there was a lot of great rhythm and blues, jazz that kind of moves forward into the 70s. And Creed Taylor has to be mentioned here. He's one of the true backbones of the jazz scene. I've talked about Creed Taylor quite a lot over the years. I haven't talked about him much recently, but he was a big part of Bethlehem's success 54, 55. He ends up getting signed away to ABC Records, who was launching a bigger jazz imprint than Bethlehem could ever imagine to be. And then he ends up convincing ABC, who was related to the film and television industry, to launch a separate jazz label called Impulse. You all know Impulse. Well, that's Creed Taylor's doing. However, Creed Taylor, after about a year running Impulse, decides that this isn't really what he was kind of wanting to do, in part because his big signing was John Coltrane. Coltrane's at Atlantic doing things like the blues and doing things like My Favorite Things, having quite a bit of success. Coltrane was accessible and had kind of crossed over. And I think in his mind, Creed was like, I can take Coltrane and meld him and control his career and be quite successful here at Impulse with a guy like John Coltrane. And of course, John Coltrane had ideas of his own. Thankfully, you definitely see Creed Taylor's mark and imprint on that whole story. And the gatefold record with the deluxe album covers, that was very much a Creed Taylor development. That was important to him, the packaging, the overall look and aesthetic of the music. And so he gets signed away to Verve Records. And Verve was, of course, Norman Granz's enterprise. Norman Granz, one of the great names in jazz. He runs the Jazz and the Philharmonica. He's touring Europe with the jazz greats of the swing era in their older years. Now these guys putting together some of the greatest shows and ensemble casts. He's recorded all this great stuff at Clef and Norgran. And obviously as Verve kind of comes into its own in the mid-50s, Verve becomes a very important label. However, as a business decision, Verve sells to new ownership at MGM. And MGM is a giant of the television and film industry. And Norman Granz's cute ideas of what things were going to be and how they wanted them to be. I don't think Norman Granz was even involved in the negotiation of the sale. I think it just kind of happened to him, because these things get so much bigger than your own ideas, money and dollars and enterprises. And so he actually kind of gets muscled out. And Creed Taylor comes into Verve in 62 and reshapes Verve. He brings that gatefold jacket from Impulse to Verve. He strips from a lot of the great labels, the small jazz labels, their talent. From Riverside, he takes Wes Montgomery, takes Bill Evans. From Blue Note, he takes Jimmy Smith, Kenny Burrell, Cal Tjader from Fantasy. He's just finding all these talented players that had some commercial aspects to them. He wasn't signing the stuff that was going to be on the edges of the music. Creed Taylor wanted to have the stuff that he knew he could do, but he couldn't do with Coltrane. And so he ends up signing some of the best talent in jazz, really hurting a lot of those small labels. Blue Note really struggled without Jimmy Smith and the sales that Jimmy Smith created. Riverside was definitely hurt by losing Wes Montgomery and losing Bill Evans. I've actually made a list somewhere, I can't find it right now, of all the guys that Creed Taylor signs away. And it's a pretty impressive list of great talent in jazz that comes to Verve in 62. That new gatefold packaging. Stan Getz gets signed away. And Getz was a huge coup for what Creed Taylor wanted to do. Getz has some new young ideas about some of his friends in Brazil who had been there, and he wants to kind of bring this Brazilian sound into jazz. And I think Creed was at first a little bit like, I'm not sure, but the success of those Stan Getz Bossa Nova records, Louis Bonfa, that whole movement that was happening, it really just overwhelms the entire jazz world and the pop world as well. You know, it's a pretty impressive. Bob Brookenmeyer is another guy who comes across and does some bossa nova stuff for Verve and Creed Taylor, and Creed Taylor runs Verve into a very commercial, well-oiled engine through the mid '60s into the late '60s. He's a real entrepreneur. His idea was having coffee table style artwork, gatefold jackets on records that middle America would want to drive home in their station wagon, put on their coffee table, and play for their family on the hi-fi. And he didn't want it to be edgy, racy. He didn't want it to be filled with cultural significance and black enterprise. He wanted it to be very accessible, safe music for white America. And so what you get at Verve is kind of, I don't want to really say watered down, but you get a very packaged pop sensibility. And the production of records, Cal Jader, Breeze from the East, the kind of overtones that whole record were these kind of Eastern Japanese themes and sounds and instruments added to the mix. So you got these kind of produced sessions. You have guys like Oliver Nelson over there producing and arranging horns. Klaus Ogerman. There's quite a few guys. The guy who does jazz samba, what's his name? Gary McFarland. He's doing a lot of arranging and production at Verve. So a lot of these records, including guys like Jimmy Smith, all of a sudden you're getting strings and these big orchestral horn things and poppier, schlockier, less jazz, less blues, less soul, less improvised. You still had some great improvised playing going on. And a guy like Jimmy Smith, he can funnel down a tornado of the blues no matter what you put behind him. He's just going to drown that shit out and play the gutsiest shit you ever heard. You know, I mean, you couldn't really deter a guy like Jimmy Smith just because you had some fancy horn arrangements on the background. And horn arrangements are different than horn playing. And even horn arrangements in a big band sense, it's somewhat different with that rhythmic pulse and the groove that those things were creating. That's quite different from the horn arrangements of a guy like Oliver Nelson in the mid '60s, where he's putting these Gil Evans-like sounds, pastels and colors behind things. It all leads to a new genre of jazz. It's kind of this chic lounge jazz that has a very marketable edge to it, beautiful deluxe covers. Anyway, Creed Taylor ends up moving along, and he moves on to Arista briefly in like '68. And at Arista, he has some creative control, but the winds of change are in the air, and jazz is changing. A lot of the core audience of jazz is dissolving. The rhythm and blues thing is really taking off. Funk and soul music are happening. There's just such a splintering of the audience. And jazz, for the diehards, the dinosaurs, it was really going extinct in the big market kind of sense. And so he has some difficulty, but he convinces Arista to let him launch his own imprint once again, called CTI, Creed Taylor Incorporated, which he ends up distributing himself through Motown down the road. And one of the big signings Creed Taylor makes is George Benson. And Benson's a very important player. He's one of the great jazz players of all time. He's rooted in the black blues gospel experience. He's raised in the hillside neighborhood of Pittsburgh, which was a very poor neighborhood. People were working 2 or 3 jobs just to survive and get by. A lot of great musicians came from the Pittsburgh hillside. I'm going to do a series of episodes coming up when my cards are done on each city by city, their production of musicians. And Pittsburgh's an impressive city that kind of shoots above its weight. They have a lot of great players. New York, Philly, Detroit are probably 1, 2, 3. Chicago's probably 4. You know, and you can make some interchangeable things there. But Pittsburgh's definitely 5, 6, 7 there somewhere. It's a great jazz city with a great jazz heritage. And a guy like Ahmad Jamal, a guy like Kenny Clark, Ray Brown. It's a long list. I've been going through a lot of stuff lately. It's pretty phenomenal. The great piano player for sorry for Ellington, Billy Strayhorn. He's a Pittsburgh guy. But Benson comes up in this great jazz tradition. And as a young kid, he starts getting gigs and recording a little bit, even as in little sessions here and there. Very under the ground, very kind of, grassrootsy. But he starts at a young age playing with the great Jack McDuff. And McDuff's an organ player at Prestige doing soul jazz. And McDuff had a following. And I told you before in that soul jazz episode I did about 4 months ago, soul jazz, organ jazz, was very much a black development in jazz. It was this back current saying jazz might be dying, but we're going to reinterpret it in this format with guitars and organs and rhythm and blues sounds and the gospel and the church and all that hodgepodge of black America. Soul jazz really encases all that. And all that stuff happened in the avant-garde and free that wasn't really selling, that doesn't really have an audience, that's become so collectible today. Soul jazz was the undercurrent that was happening that was more mainstream in jazz. So Benson's a part of that as a young kid. And he learns his chops. He's an incredible player. He has an incredible tonality. He's a very diverse player. And he might be the greatest jazz guitar player of all time. It's a tough thing to label, and I'm not one much for giving those type of titles and labels to people. Greatest ever. That's not really what I do, because it's such an objective thing. But if you're a guitar player, you know that Wes Montgomery is a special, special breed. And you also recognize that George Benson was a guy you can't do everything he did. And like a lot of the other players like Grant Green are kind of singular mode players. They do one thing, they do it well. But a guy like Benson can do a lot of things. Incredibly beautiful player. Incredible licks. And a great virtuoso as well. But it's always from the place of the blues and this place of soul and feeling. And I always feel Benson's stuff. And of course, Benson climbs to the very top of the hill in 1979, working with Quincy Jones, and I'll show you that in a minute. And by the time he's working with Quincy Jones, Give Me the Night, that record was huge. And it's the same time as Michael Jackson Off the Wall. It's the same time as he's working with the Brothers Johnson, Quincy Jones. It's the same time as he's working with Rufus and Chaka Khan. Any Love from that Chaka Khan record? Oh, that record's so good. That Pink record, Chaka Khan, Rufus, that was produced by Quincy Jones from 79. That's one of the best funk disco records you'll ever hear. And Quincy's production, his ear, his way of perceiving what people want to hear is pretty unrivaled. Quincy was a brilliant, brilliant mind. And from Quincy's roots in jazz as a young trumpet player and a young arranger, in the early 50s, when he's first arriving, guys who've been around for decades are already saying, let's do Quincy Jones arrangements. Guys like Sonny Stitt, the writes from the pen of Quincy Jones. He's playing Quincy Jones arrangements, and Quincy's a young kid. So Quincy's a very important figure. And he helps bring George Benson to the masses in the late 70s. And he really kind of lives off that legacy into the 80s and 90s. And he doesn't pass until like 2013, 2014, I think it was. Sometime in the last 10 years, George Benson passed. I think I was still DJing for the black community at that point, because it was a big loss for a lot of people. People loved George Benson. And for the most part, middle-aged black America thinks of George Benson as jazz. Grover Washington as jazz. That's what they think of as jazz music. They don't think of Miles Davis and Thelonious Monk. That's kind of foreign to them, to be honest, which was always kind of shocking to me. The trad jazz of the 50s, the 60s, and the 30s, 40s, it's kind of lost in the modern black community. Benson, Grover Washington, even Donald Byrd, Blackbirds, that kind of stuff, that was what they thought of as jazz music, and it was relevant to them. It was still danceable. You could put on breezing and the whole place would be doing, and they love it. They absolutely loved it. So I'm learning a lot from the black community itself in terms of like people like, why don't black people listen to jazz? Well, they do. They did. It just, they listened to the jazz that they liked. That was accessible and fun. And so much of what we as white jazz consumers today think of as jazz in the 60s and 70s, it's coming from a very jaded viewpoint that they don't see eye to eye on in any way, shape, or form. And it was quite eye-opening for me. So Benson, Pittsburgh, Hillside, poverty, young player with chops. He's playing with Jack McDuff. He's learning the trade. And he plays with McDuff for a couple years. Really cuts his teeth and becomes kind of an icon at an early age and a bit of a celebrity even in the Pittsburgh area as a young player that was going to be someone who's going to shake things up. And his first release was for Prestige. And remember, he's playing with Jack McDuff on Prestige. So they give him his own record, the New Boss Guitar of George Benson, with the Brother Jack McDuff Quartet. And this is what's playing right now. And it's got a great shuffle, a great beat, super accessible. Red Holloway on the tenor is just a wonderful player. Montego Joe on the drums. Ronnie Boykins on the bass, who plays, I think, on a number of Benson records, actually. And so he makes quite an imprint here at Prestige. And Creed Taylor is aware of George Benson. And Benson does a couple records for Columbia, 65, 66 or so. Maybe even 66, 67. It's Uptown with the George Benson Quartet, featuring the most exciting new guitarists on the jazz scene today. Again, that's on Columbia. And then George Benson's Cookbook with Lonnie Smith on the organ. Both these records on Columbia are great cooking, fairly middle-of-the-road, accessible jazz guitar records. They're not too hard to come by, and they should be sought after by players of guitar and people who like great jazz music from that era. So he eventually gets signed to Verve, and this is towards the end of Creed Taylor's run at Verve. If Creed's even still there, I'm pretty sure he is. 87-49 and 87-71. Giblet Gravy, which is kind of a gross name. And Goodies. Both kind of have a foodie theme going on. Which, again, that's part of the Black Soul Food, Soul Kitchen. A lot of those songs had food titles, chitlins, chicken, black eyed peas. It was a big part of the community, and it was kind of almost a coded thing saying, yeah, black people, this is for you. And they always got that. These Verve records are great, not too tough to find. Verve records sold pretty well. So Creed Taylor, like I said, goes to Arista and starts a little small CTI before CTI officially launches. And in the first probably 60 records that are on Arista of CTI, Benson has a number of releases. Beyond the Blue Horizon, George Benson. And these bordered covers are a prelude to what happens when he actually forms CTI in a couple of years, where the covers go even to the next level with the photography and the beautiful artwork. It's just a beautiful, I guess it's a smokestack, probably at an iron smelting plant by the looks of it. And Pittsburgh, of course, was the Steel City. So What? There's a great version of the Miles Davis tune on here. Gentle Rain's wonderful. Ode to a Kudu, which is a label CTI uses a little bit down the road. Kudu. Great stuff. And then he follows that up really quickly with The Shape of Jazz, The Shape of Things to Come, which is an album cover with these kind of weird shapes, modern art looking thing. That's something that the CTI imprint and will use quite a lot. Tell It Like It Is, George Benson, arranged and conducted by Marty Scheller. Soul Limbo, Are You Happy? Tell It Like It Is. He's not afraid to do any material. He can put the George Benson imprint on just about anything and make it accessible and fun. And a lot of these CTI records will have multiple bass players and drummers for different tracks, different sessions. So it becomes quite a long list of players. But trust me when I say the level of musicianship at CTI is unparalleled. He gets the best of the best. Rudy Van Gelder was still a big part of this story here. This is recorded at Van Gelder Studios in 1969 with Van Gelder Engineering. And so it's just the cream of the crop, the creme de la creme, are making these records with this young George Benson turning the world on fire. Now, George Benson, the other side of Abbey Road, is an Arista, A&M, 3028. I've been saying Arista, it's A&M. 3028. Then this is the other side of Abbey Road. He's basically doing the Beatles' Abbey Road songs in a jazz R&B context. And they're the kind of songs actually you might hear some of these tunes in a movie, and you're like, what's this boogie version of Beatles stuff? It's Benson. He was just a universally talented guy. And so now they officially go to the CTI imprint. It's probably about 1969-70. Freddie Hubbard, Red Clay. Boy, there's just some great stuff happening at CTI when they launch. Benson's first release is 6015, The White Rabbit, arranged by Don Sebesky. There's another guy that does a lot of big arrangements with horns, and kind of the canned aspect of CTI is the same thing at Verve and a lot of Impulse records too. It's those arrangers that make it sound stiffer and more sterile and cleansed. They've taken some of the blues and some of the improvisation and some of the freedom of the blues out of it and made it very polished. You know, I mean, this is on network TV now, guys, so we can't have anything too edgy. And so these arrangers are really making sure things have a real clean sound. But listen to the band here. You got Herbie Hancock, Ron Carter, both post Miles Davis, Hubert Laws, the great flautist, Airto, the Brazilian percussionist, Jay Berliner, Earl Klug, and Billy Cobham. So just, again, an incredible ensemble of musicians. And what you're going to get here is something between art rock and jazz and polished R&B. It's just a real pastiche, mixed up soundscape, but it's very well produced, very well put together. This is Body Talk 6033. I think this one might have another album cover. I can't remember exactly. But it's a cheap cover with no gatefold. This is George Benson, Bad Benson 6045. This record was a big hit for him. And 2 or 3 of his records here at CTI were quite popular. They topped the jazz charts in the 70s numerous times, and sometimes even crossed over into the R&B charts. No Sooner Said Than Done, The Changing World, just really top of the mark stuff. And again, let's take a look at the musicians on this, because the pedigree is important. We got Phil Upchurch, George Benson, Kenny Barron, Ron Carter, Steve Gadd, Alan Rubin, Joe Shepley, Garnett Brown, who plays briefly with Coltrane in the late 60s. French horn, you got guys like Brooks Tillotson, Jim Buffington, woodwinds. You got all kinds of players there. You got 3 or 4 cellists here, more like 6 cellists. Geez, harp. And so you're getting these big productions. And again, you're taking away some of the blues and the black hillside music with some of this polish that Creed Taylor is providing. But you're also making a music that white America felt really comfortable taking home. These records sold really well. Good King Bad is a fantastic record. Again, it's Benson kind of at one of the pinnacles of his career at this point. Again, the lineup here is just incredible. Eric Gale shows up. Ronnie Foster, Roland Hanna, Bobby Lyle, Dennis Davis, Steve Gadd. It's just a long list of players. Randy Brecker, Michael Brecker, David Sanborn. So you're seeing a lot of that Joe Farrell. You see a lot of that next generation of guys here showing up and having cello again. So again, you're getting a fairly wide mix here. And this is Benson with Joe Farrell. Farrell's a great sax player, tenor, and Farrell's records on his own can be somewhat out with edges of avant-garde at times. He can be kind of a player with some edge. George Benson Space 7085. This is towards the ends of his run at CTI. And then he moves on to a bigger label. And it's here where his pop status really kind of ascends. This is on Warner Brothers, and this has This Masquerade. And it's also got the song Breezin'. And Breezin' is one of the great songs in the canon. And you could argue it's as much in the R&B canon as it is in the jazz canon, but it's in the canon. And it's just such a fun tune. Written by Bobby Womack. I didn't realize that. Bobby Womack's one of the great soul singers of the 70s. Just a fantastic tour de force with a poppy, beautiful production. And then here's the real pinnacle of his career in a lot of ways. Give Me the Night. Again, this is the Quincy Jones masterpiece. And this entire record is just polished, beautiful, massive hits. So many good songs in here. Love Times Love, Off Broadway, Give Me the Night's just a staple of the dance scene of that time. Love Dance, Midnight Love Affair. It's just a really great affair. It's a session filled with all kinds of thunder. So Benson goes on. Like that's kind of his legacy right there. The last two records for sure. But that CTI stuff is really important as well. And even that early stuff on Columbia and Verve and Prestige, you really start to see this guy's development and what a talent George Benson was. And I don't talk about that era of jazz very often. You know, I really delved into it quite deeply for a while. And it's something you can play more at the bar, really, as a DJ than you can trad jazz. But as I've DJ'd less and become more a guy who wants to DJ brunch sets and DJ a loungy setting and not a nightclub at night, the more trad jazz I could play. And I still love to throw the R&B side of jazz things in. You know what I mean? Give me some of that Donald Byrd stuff from the 70s, and I'll play that anytime I can. You know, there's usually one head in the room who's like, yeah, Domino, sweet. You know what I mean? That guy's going to get it. But a lot of cats, you know what I mean? We've moved so far from the 70s. That's the one thing when I started DJing. The 70s were old, but they were still connectable. Now when you DJ to a room of 20-somethings, the 70s are as old to them as the 40s and 50s were to me as a kid. And so, again, it's up to us to make these kids know about that music. Because the music of the 20th century is very important. And the music of the 20th century will go down as probably one of the great centuries of music. There was so many developments that happened. So many social aspects, so many technological aspects, and things that just fundamentally changed music forever. And so the 20th century, as we came out of Jim Crow and slavery and the black music that's creating this new sound in America and the British imitating that black sound, and then white America loving that British music that was really black American music, and then all the music that hits the pop charts being kind of borrowed from the black lexicon of rhythm and blues and vocalizing like Armstrong taught everyone how to do. People don't realize the fingerprints of jazz and blues, how omnipresent it is. The blues are in so much of rock and roll. And we don't really grasp it often in our rock and roll mindset, but it's so omnipresent. Armstrong's vocalizing, how he sang behind the beat, how he created his own rhythm and adjusted melody and harmony. Armstrong is an incredible figurehead for all singers, even if they don't know it. You know, so there's a legacy that was created in the 20th century that's still the blueprint today. And the 21st century is going to have to go an awful long way to supersede what happened in the 20th century. You know, I mean, it's going to take a lot of doing for these next 80 years, 78 years, whatever it is at this point, to have any kind of impact that even compares to what happened in the last 100 years in the 20th century. It was an incredible century of music, on par with anything that happened before it, and in my mind, greater than anything happened before it. There's something about that black experience that made it music that was full of energy and life and pulse, and it was just undeniable. And it transcends and transforms across decades, across genres, across races, across religions, and that black music really becomes omnipresent internationally. And even like a lot of the EDM scene, the dance electronic scene, house music, techno music, it comes from the disco scene, which comes from black music. And so it's just an incredible legacy of a people reinterpreting sound in a way that made sense to them, that was sexual, sensual, fun, celebratory, never rigid, never taking itself too serious. That transforms everything around it. And it's still doing that today. That's the amazing thing, is that the legacy of this music is still omnipresent. And I think we really lose sight of that at times. We get into our little tunnels and we think that this is the newest, coolest, innovative thing, and no one before this ever could have imagined it. Yet, so often it's just regurgitating things just with a new gadget, a new instrument, a new sound effect. but it's still making the same shapes with the same scales, the same notes, the same melodies. Some things can't be reinvented in some way. It's going to take a lot of shaking up. Even like some of the innovations in rock and pop. Grunge wasn't really reinventing nothing. It was just going back to a bluesier sound, stripping away some of the materialistic fluff and saccharine nature of what rock and roll had become. Punk rock's doing some of that same thing, taking it back to the roots. Letty Ledbetter could tell you about that. You know what I mean? Ledbetter could tell you about that, about taking it down to the essence. Robert Johnson could tell you about that. The blues is the essence, and it's at the root of everything. And you could say that ragtime kind of precedes the blues on some levels, which it does. But the blues is an innovation of its own that stands on its own. And even jazz must kneel at the foot of the blues, because the blues is such an omnipresent, simple way of expressing myself. It's not about reinventing things and being so innovative and creative and brilliant. It's just a simple template that says, okay, there's my template. Now I can say what's on my mind. And there's something so brilliant about that formula. Something so immediate, so tangible, so connectable, and something so honest. And I think at the end of the day, that honesty is its greatest selling point and attribute. Because all of us in our walk through life are trying to connect with something. We want to connect with something we can feel, something that makes sense, something that doesn't feel phony. And the news, after long, becomes talking heads full of garbage. Politics and religion become talking heads full of divisiveness and garbage opinions, trying to garner my concerns to probably control money somehow, maybe even my money. The honest of a musician speaking the blues, they aren't even interested in my 2 cents. They'll be happy if I throw my 2 cents in their hat or their guitar case, but they ain't going to take it from me. Because they're just trying to figure out how they're going to get some sweet jelly roll tonight and find a place to sleep with a pillow under their head. That's the essence of the blues, survival. Survival. And let's find this a template that I can be in any town in this country, find some people that can speak the same template, and we can shake it down. We can shake down and find some joy, a reason to celebrate. And if we're lucky, we'll get some people dancing and shaking and grooving. And if you don't know what dancing leads to, you ain't grown up yet. Because dancing is a precursor to the horizontal dance. You know what I mean? We start vertical, we end up horizontal. And if you ain't doing the thing. You ain't doing it. That's just how that goes. So that's it for today. If you enjoyed the channel and the content here and then the commentary, please comment below and give us a thumbs up. If you want to subscribe to the channel, that's always appreciated. We appreciate subscribers. If you want to support the channel in any way, go to the Patreon in the description below. You go to the merchandise store and buy a hoodie or a t-shirt. That's always appreciated. Y'all be safe. Stay out of trouble. We'll be back with you soon. I'll probably make an episode Sunday. See how this one goes. Appreciate y'all for your support, all for watching the channel. We'll talk to y'all soon. Peace. Hey guys, so for 500, I guess we're going to make this episode featuring clips from y'all talking about your favorite jazz, what era you love, artists, and why you appreciate this channel, what this channel has meant to you in your jazz journey. Just to celebrate the channel, we're going to get everyone else who wants to participate, throw me a little video, keep it under 2 minutes, and that way we can all kind of put faces to some of the names from the commenters, people who chat back and forth in the comments. Hopefully we can all kind of get to know each other a little bit deeper with some facial recognition and some FaceTime on screen. Send those videos. I think we'll go with just send them to my email. I'm not sure how else to do it. I think that'll be the simplest for now. But make sure you message me in the comments on the episode that you sent it so I know to look for it. My email is vanijl, VANEIJL @yahoo.com. vanijl @yahoo.com. Send me your little video clips there. And if you want to send them in another format, that's fine. I'm sure between me and my wife, I can figure out how to get them into my program to edit them and put them together. So that's where we're going to go with it for now. Thanks a lot, guys. Love you all. Peace.